This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA supports animal studies scholars, artists, advocates, people who are interested in thinking deeply about animal issues. It does a lot of things. It has a conference, it has a Facebook page, it has a website. So it's doing a lot of things to try and encourage deep thinking on animal issues. So if you're not a member of ASA, I strongly encourage you to think about joining. That's ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. This episode is also brought to you by Animal Publics. Animal Publics is a magnificent book series. It comes out of the University of Sydney Press. And Animal Publics is a book series specifically dedicated to, again, thinking deeply about animal issues. It publishes books that are political analysis, historical analysis, beautiful, beautiful narratives, beautiful stories. There's lots over at the Animal Publics book series. So if you're wondering where to get some wonderful books on animal issues, check out Animal Publics, which is part of the University of Sydney Press. Okay, let's get down to business. Now, we are in the home of the podcast, of the Knowing Animals podcast here in beautiful Annandale. Sadly, today is one of the days in which we are very, very worried about loss of human and animal life and habitat as part of the fires that have been happening around Sydney and Victoria. So it's a really, really sad day, and our hearts go out to anyone who is dealing with the bushfires and dealing with loss of property, loss of loved ones. We know that it's just so sad. It's an extremely hot day today in Sydney. It's very smoky, but we're trying to keep on with life as much as we can. We're luckily safe here in Annandale. And I've been joined by a wonderful guest who's travelled a long way to be on the podcast. So I'm really, really, really pleased to have her here. So this week I'm joined by Justine Groizard. Did I do that okay? Yes, I'm getting a nod. Justine is a PhD student at the University of Newcastle, where I was a student. That's in Australia, not in the UK. And today we're going to discuss Justine's article, Greyhounds and Racing Industry Participants, a look at the New South Wales Greyhound racing community, which appeared in the Animal Studies Journal in 2019. Welcome to the podcast, Justine.
Thanks, Siobhan. Thank you so much for having me.
So, why this article? What brought it about?
So, my interest in greyhound racing and greyhound rescue started right from when I was a child. I grew up in a greyhound racing family. When I say that, it has been a greyhound racing family for generations. So typically what would happen in my family is that it's largely the man of the house would sort of race the dogs, and for a lot of generations it would sort of be like then the sons would help them out with that. So in my family, it's just me and my sister. So I sort of, me and my dad, are best friends. So I would race the dogs with him. So I really liked that, particularly because I've always really been drawn to animals, to spending time with animals. So as a kid, it was really cool for me that my afternoons were constituted with spending time with the dogs, getting responsibilities with dogs. I knew a lot more about dogs than other kids my age. So what I find interesting to note here is that typically greyhound racing is really attributed with this mistreatment of greyhounds, which in some instances is definitely true. But what I found interesting in later years is that it's my upbringing within this kind of a family that has led to being the person I am now, which is someone who sees dogs as members of the family, that dogs should always be respected, and that they're important for their own sake. But growing up, it kind of took a while for me to get my head around how I was with greyhound racing. So to begin with, I would help my dad with the dogs, and then when I would go down one afternoon and a dog wouldn't be there anymore, I would think they were all going to this magical farm that existed, that any greyhound that wasn't fast enough was welcome to live this wonderful life on this great big farm. And then as I got older and I started to understand that they weren't going to a farm, that they were actually being taken to the vet and being put down. I should note in this bit too that I often use the phrases put down, put to sleep. I know that in the animal studies field, a lot of the time it is preferable to simply say what that is, which is when an animal is healthy and you are having them given lethal injection, that is killing them. But as an anthropologist, I tend to use the language of my participants so as to keep trust, keep a good rapport. So they would be taken to the vets and put down. The more I got to understand that, the more I developed this hatred of racing. So what kept me involved for so long was when I was 12, I was told that if I worked for my dad, I could buy my own puppy. So before and after primary school, I would go down, clean out the kennels. By a very early age, I knew how to administer medications, walk 4 dogs on a lead at once, all types of things that I thought were totally normal. And then now I'm like, wow, I was a really handy little kid with dogs. So I would get $50 a week for doing that work. And then I saved up that money and bought my own greyhound puppy, who I named Beckham, who the article is partly dedicated to. So when I started to realise what was actually happening to the greyhounds, it caused a lot of fights between me and my dad. I stayed in the sort of racing sphere for a lot longer because by that time Beckham was a racing dog. I wanted to stay close to him. But it ended up just causing way too many fights, too much heartbreak, huge family fights, and pretty much I ended up deciding I actually hated racing and saying I'd always hated racing. I just didn't know I hated it. And I then moved out, took Beckham with me, and we left the racing sphere. So then I sort of lived for a few years as an anti-racing person. I joined social media groups that were against greyhound racing, etc. And then I started my honours degree, which came about through me not knowing what I wanted to do with my life, scraping through into honours, meeting an amazing supervisor who told me that my dreams of working with animals could actually happen after I'd decided I was not smart enough to be a vet, so that wasn't the career path I was going to have. She helped me to see that I could research dogs. So I decided to explore something in greyhound racing that had always really, really bugged me, and that was that greyhound racing people went on and on about how much they loved their dogs. And then I would say to them, well, you don't love the dogs because then you take them and you get them put down. So how is that love? And the idea that I could explore that in a research capacity was so exciting. So I re-entered the sphere of racing, and I started my honours work on looking at how it is that greyhound racing people say they love their dogs, then get rid of them. How it is that I grew up in a racing family that taught me to have such respect and be so good with dogs, better than other people that I'd gone to school with who would, pull their ears and not be very nice to dogs, but yet still be okay with this getting rid of the dogs when they were too slow. And quite often I would get told, that eventually I would harden up to it, that's just the way things are. And I just couldn't reconcile that. So doing that through research was really interesting to me. And this article largely draws on that honours research that explores that.
Wonderful. How fascinating. So I've got a lot of questions, but I think perhaps a lot of listeners will know, perhaps not intuitively, but just through experience, what greyhound racing is and what greyhounds are. But it's possible some may not. Can you say something about the animals and the kind of the way they race and that kind of thing?
Yep. So greyhound racing has been around in Australia since colonisation. So it's basically when greyhounds are put in what's called starting boxes, an artificial lure goes round, the starting boxes open up, the greyhounds race around a circular or straight track. Generally these days it's more circular, which in itself is an issue that I could get into, but I'll pause for now. But they race around a circular track, and they do it for prize money. But more than the prize money is the money generally that can come about through betting on these things. Now, there's different types of people that engage in racing, which is part of what I explore in the article. You've got your hobby owner, trainer, breeder. They typically have everyday contact with the dog. They know the dogs have names. And these are typically the people that I work with and who I'm talking about when I say greyhound racing people. There are also what's called like the big time owners and trainers, trainers who have, so many dogs. I once interviewed someone who he did have so many dogs that he didn't actually know exactly how many dogs he had. He told me he had never gone out and actually counted all the dogs. So sometimes you do get trainers like that have that many that they're not that close with the dog. Then you also have your big time owners. So I've worked with some rescue people who were organising getting a dog from someone who they believed to be the owner. This guy was really helpful to them because they found out that he wasn't the owner. The owner was a heart surgeon in Sydney who had never met this 5-year-old dog that he owned. And I think that's really problematic in itself. So, yeah, they're sort of the three main types of people you get in racing.
Interesting. And the animals are, they're purposely bred, and they're the beautiful, lean, long-legged dogs.
Yep. Long noses, long legs. They can be quite different to other breeds of dogs in their behaviour. But what I'm looking at partially now as well is that a symptom of the upbringing that they have, or is it something inherent in the breed? So greyhounds generally will stay with their litter mates a lot longer than your pet dogs. They'll eventually get moved out into big paddocks, and then eventually they'll get moved into the kennels with the other dogs, what's called broken in, which is they get taught to chase the lure, they get taught to being checked over, having all their limbs pulled around and stuff to check that they're, not in a cruel way, to check that, they're okay and they're in racing condition, taught to go in the boxes and out. So they have a very different life up to retirement, rescue, whichever you want to call it, than do your typical dog. So I think what I'm thinking is that it's as a result of that their behaviour is quite different to other dogs.
Interesting. So in the article you note that there have been some very significant scandals in Australia, so publicity by animal advocates that show deeply problematic behaviour by at least some people within the greyhound racing communities. Could you explain to listeners what came about, what was exposed?
Yeah, so Animals Australia in 2015 released undercover footage they had of people blooding the dogs, which is, so greyhounds are naturally, they're very, very gentle breed. So some trainers did and do, I guess, believe that a greyhound will run faster if you, trigger that instinct to run and to kill. So they would annoy or entice greyhounds to try and kill live animals to try and incite that sort of bloodlust in them. So typically they would use helpless animals to do that so that their greyhounds can't be hurt. And so obviously it's essentially the murder of one animal and the complete just violating of the nature of another animal. Following that exposure, there was another one that demonstrated that greyhounds were being exported out to countries where the animal welfare standards are just not as high as here, and the horrible ways that they were being treated as a result of that.
And, of course, the other big issue is wastage.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you explain to us what that is?
So wastage is the fact that for greyhound people to be racing greyhounds, they need to have a racing greyhound. And the issue with that is that greyhounds can live up to 15. Generally, it's about 12, 13. But a greyhound's racing career generally tends to be over at about 4 years old. And they don't start racing until they're over a year. So their racing time span is actually quite short, but to stay a greyhound racing person, you have to have a greyhound that's racing, or you're not going to the tracks and you're not taking part in racing. So what that naturally leads to is people's kennels filling up, them not being able to afford or have the space to have that many greyhounds, and so they need to make room somehow. So that puts, at the moment, with the changed regulations, which I'll go into in a second, that is putting enormous pressure on the rescue and rehoming groups. Because with the change regulations, you cannot just have dogs put down anymore. You have to try to have them rehomed at least twice with the industry-affiliated rehoming program and once with another rescue organisation. So it's putting enormous pressure on them at the moment. Prior to this, to these kind of regulations, you were allowed to just get your dog put down. So what would commonly happen, what I would see amongst the communities that I was in, is you take your greyhound to the vet, you drop them off, you pay your $80, $90, and they're euthanized. Back when I was it's an interesting thing, because when I was growing up, I sort of grew to see my family and family friends as the most evil people ever for doing that, which I still don't condone that. But now doing research more in depth, that was actually in those days seen as sort of the people doing the nicer sort of thing, because greyhounds were also killed in more horrific ways, and there was just not as much regulation and tracking of greyhound lives, and so people were just able to kill them themselves.
Interesting. So I guess that brings us to one of the key arguments you make in the paper, which is this notion that there are a multitude of communities, that it's perhaps ill-conceived to think of greyhound racing as this singular community. But at the same time, you also point to the fact that it does give people a sense of purpose and a sense of community. So there's these it creates community, but multiple communities. Can you explain to us how that works and what you see in that the data you collected?
Yeah, so it's a difficult sort of thing. A large part of what I'm doing in my research and in my PhD now is that I want to look at how we can do what's best for the non-human animals without sort of making enemies of people who see themselves as animal people, but maybe not in the same way as animal activists and people that fall into that kind of a category. So a lot of the people I work with that race greyhounds, they are, working class background. They don't hold a lot of esteem in their own career, but when I ask them, what do you do? They'll answer with, oh, well, I race greyhounds. Even though that's actually their hobby, that's not their career. They have said, they don't take real pride in what their career is, but that doesn't matter, because what they're good at is racing greyhounds. What they're good at is knowing when a dog's sick, that all dogs like them. I hear that quite a bit, that racing people quite pride themselves on the fact that they're really good with dogs and that all dogs like them. So there's this real sort of pride in the love between human and animal, which is interesting, and it's I just know sometimes how weird it sounds me saying this in relation to greyhound racing, but I think it's important to go in and understand that kind of thing. What was the other part of your question? Sorry.
The other part of the question is, though, that it's not just one group. This isn't a singular community. This is different.
Yeah, so you've got your big time trainers, your big time owners, all that. You've also got your people that will attend the tracks simply for betting and drinking purposes. And a lot of the people that I work with, they say that this really irritates them, because for them the track meetings are a place for skill and knowledge and community. So that when they see people getting blind drunk at the track and only betting, this sort of frustrates them, because to them it's more about watching the dogs run. There's a real art and a real science about it, and they don't like to have that undermined. A lot of the racing people that I work with, they actually don't bet themselves, which is a lot of them do, but I do find it interesting that a lot of them actually don't do any betting themselves.
So with this more complex and nuanced lens that you bring to the issue, how can we work with those ideas to perhaps improve racing or advocate for the animals, or what does this mean for us?
I think I still need to look. There's still much more research to be done, but I think one of the big things we can do is be patient with one another, which I know is very difficult when there are animal lives and well-beings at stake. With the change regulations now, there are a lot less greyhound deaths happening that we know of. We've always got to take information like that with a grain of salt. But I think it's what really bothered me when the greyhound racing ban came in is that the communities that I had been around and that I had been working with, they used to see themselves as quite separate communities. And people who, for instance, were doing illegal activities with their dogs would sort of be outed by the community because, let's say, people who were doping their dogs. That was unfair for the people who were just good at racing dogs because they're good at it and they have skill and they have an understanding with their dogs. So what I saw when the ban came in and racing was attacked on such a large scale was the community actually started to band together and protect one another, including those. So it was a bringing together of, the old man in Taree who has 1 million dogs, who's 1 million years old. He keeps every single dog that he possibly can. He's got 10 retired greyhounds in his lounge room. And the guy who, just did it because he thought he'd get a lucky break and is doping his dog every weekend. So bringing those people together I saw as really, really bad. And what I would like to do and what I sort of attempt to do is to utilise more of a dialogue between the rescue and rehoming organisations that do actually care about the dogs and the racing people who argue to me that getting their dogs put down, giving them up for adoption, that it's the most heartbreaking thing and that it really, really hurts them and that they love the dogs. I think what I'm getting at is I think in greyhound racing and rescue, the dialogue between it, what I see a lot is that racing people say we love our dogs. And a lot of people answer back, no, you don't. Whereas I think if someone says that they love something or someone, what I try and do is say, okay, I believe you, but I want to learn more about that because that doesn't fit into what my idea of what love is. But I think if we can understand that more, and just because it doesn't fit into what my idea of what love is, doesn't mean that it's not real. That doesn't mean that it's not there. So how can we understand that idea of love more? How can we utilize that idea of love more to better the dogs? If the racing people that love their dogs, if what they want is what's best for the dogs, and the rescue people, what they want is definitely what's best for the dogs, I see no reason why we can't work together. Not that it's not a very long journey, but I see no reason why we can't work together to try and achieve that one goal.
Fascinating. So this might take us a little bit away from the article, but you're obviously an expert and I'm very interested in your opinion. When you think about an ideal future for greyhounds, does it involve racing of some sort, or is it unrealistic to even imagine a future without greyhound racing, or what could an ethical future be?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this, and something that made me think about this a lot was some of my rescue participants race their dogs. So they don't do it in the conventional way, but they will take their dogs to straight tracks and they will let them race sometimes against racing participants, greyhounds. And they'll put them in the starting boxes if they like it. And these are the really hardcore, no, we want racing band people. So I found that really interesting. So I think what I sort of imagine is what I would like to see is something where there's more racing, but removing that real neoliberal evil hold that there is over it. So removing the betting, ideally, removing the betting, removing the prize money, and that people just race for ribbons or something like that. It's an interesting thing where some of the rescue picnics with people, with rescue participants I go to, they hold dog races and the dogs that win get a ribbon. And now they're thinking they're going to have to introduce a new category because now there's so many more rescue greyhounds along. There'll be like a pug and a beagle versus a greyhound, and it's a totally unfair race. So I find that really interesting that it's not racing that a lot of my rescue participants have a problem with. It's the industry as it is now, but it's not actually the race itself. In terms of the race itself, what I would also like to see as maybe just a small movement forward is less circular tracks, more straight tracks. There's significantly less injuries on the straight tracks. The circular tracks going around the corners, that's when most of the injuries do occur. And what's interesting about that is when I ask my racing participants about that, they mostly all prefer the straight tracks as well. So that's another thing. I've got some rescue participants who also say that if there was maybe more straight tracks, they wouldn't have as much of a problem with it. If there was no wastage, more straight tracks. So yeah, ideally it's hard. I think ideally I would like to see maybe just a start over, that, you know, people can still keep their identities, keep racing, but that these racing participants themselves, they argue that it's not for money. So I would like to take that as truth and say, okay, let's do racing for ribbons. And yeah, which is very hopeful thinking, but
No, I mean, it's a very, very fascinating way of thinking about it. And, you know, we have, you know, there might be a local event where people can turn up and, you know, which dog and human look most similar, and it's for fun. And no, I don't think many people think that's deeply unethical to, you know, put a bow in your hair and put a bow on your dog and go and, you know, walk around in a circle, because there's no stakes. And if the dog doesn't win, you don't then go and shoot the dog in the backyard later on that night. You just go back to your normal life. It's just a bit of fun.
yes.
So it's about that commercialization and that the money. It's about the money.
Yeah, well, and so there's a lot. Donna Haraway writes a lot about her agility work with her dog, and you can see even in reading her works, that's a huge part of her identity. And there has been some work done on agility work that, you know, that the human dog relationship is there. It's wonderful, and the agility work's really important. But then the dog doesn't get gotten rid of or put down or killed if they're no good at the agility work. As far as I know, I'm not an expert on agility, but I would like to see something more like that.
Fascinating. Well, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I think so.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
The first piece I ever read, I'm sure was, I did an environmental ethics course, and I'm sure was something Peter Singer. But the first piece that really stood out to me was Carol Adams' The Sexual Politics of Meat, which I'm sure is a really super common answer. But yeah, that really stood out to me, and it's still one of the most well looked at books in my bookshelf.
Wonderful. So what's the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
In terms of being published, it would be this one. In regards to academic, it would be my honours thesis. But something that I wrote when I was 12 was actually we were all asked to make a book, and I wrote a book called Greyhounds, The Face Behind the Muzzle. And it was about the plight of greyhounds who are not adopted. And essentially, I obviously, I think I was 11 actually, as an 11-year-old, didn't quite understand how involved it was. So it was essentially a book talking about how wonderful pets greyhound make, and really guilting anyone that did not already have a pet greyhound. Why did they not have a pet greyhound? Greyhounds needed homes. So you need to go out and get a greyhound right now, or you're doing the wrong thing.
And this isn't an official 5 quick questions, but do greyhounds make good pets?
They make the best pets. They do make the best pets, actually, but I don't want to do something that I'm always saying other people shouldn't do. But they are all different. There is a lot of ideas out there about that they are the perfect pet because they're this couch potato and they never do anything wrong and they're amazing. Some are like that. They're not all like that. So there is something I am finding where a lot of people are rushing out to adopt greyhounds. then they're finding that they're not this perfect couch potato that never does anything and is perfect, and then they're sending them back. And that's an issue. So they do make wonderful pets, but I think like any dog, you have to be ready for things to go wrong. They're very sensitive, but they don't show it quite as much as other dogs, but you have to be aware that they're sensitive. They don't like yelling. They take things to heart. If you get them in trouble, they sort of get really like, you can see it hurt their soul. So you have to be gentle with them. They're a very gentle breed, and one of the big things I found is that other greyhound people will probably laugh at this, greyhound owners, but there's a lot that goes around about them being odorless, and that's because they typically don't get that really doggy smell. But they do smell. They fart more than any other dog breed that I have ever known, and every greyhound owner can attest to that. So I always found it quite funny. I always find it quite funny when I see, and they're odorless, because a lot of my participants, I've started to say, so what about how these odorless greyhounds that exist? And they're like, nope, haven't met one of them.
Fascinating. Well, if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
There are so many, but I think I would have to say Nick Taylor and Margot DeMello, mainly because I used a lot of their work in honours, and as a first-in-family uni person, as a first-in-family U10 certificate getter, this academic world I'm sort of in now still feels like a bit of a dream. So the first, meeting people whose names I've read on articles was sort of the same as meeting a celebrity. And when I met the two of them, I was totally fangirling. And the fact that they took time to talk to me, and they went to my presentations, and they had comments and questions, that has just made such a huge impact on how I see my own work. So yeah, I would probably have that. They were two of the first sort of people.
Wonderful,
yeah.
Lovely. Both previous guests, both wonderful, wonderful people. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think academics is just to consider them, specifically non-animal studies academics. I think to just consider animals and to just be kind to people who do consider animals. I find that in the non-animal studies places sometimes to care about animals it's still okay to sort of be passed off as a bit of a joke. And I think along those lines, I think as an animal studies scholar, it's important to try and move in circles of not just animal studies scholars and, do our part to try and normalise that animals do matter, and, they matter to people, particularly in terms of animal death and passing. I think we need to take those moments seriously, and we need to take other people's feelings seriously, and we need to take animal feelings more seriously.
Absolutely. Well, if you had the power to change one thing about the human, non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think I would like to see just more respect and more. I think I would like to see people having more time for animals. Like if you see, particularly at the moment in Australia, leaving water out for animals when it's so hot. As humans, we're able to sit, in our air-conditioned houses, and then that's okay for us. But there are others who are suffering, and as humans, we have this enormous power to impact non-humans all around us all the time. So little things like leaving water out, if you see, a lost dog pulling over and taking the time, and for that to be more accepted. I've been late to meetings and such before because I found lost dogs. Most of the people I work with are always okay with that, but then I do get that sense of shame. Whereas I think if I had found a lost child and I had stopped and then been late for the meeting to return the lost child, then that would be okay. So I think I would just like to see more consideration between everyone and more time for non-humans, even even people who don't want to advocate, or they don't want to be activists, or they don't want to do animal studies, just more time for each other.
Wonderful. Well, what are you working on next?
My PhD. I have 15 more interviews to go, and then I'm doing my write-up this year. And basically the PhD is just an expansion of the honours work, except for I am exploring rescue as well, people that move in the rescue spheres, and interestingly, the people that are in between, which there are a lot of them, and each of those particularly have really interesting stories about that they either consider themselves racing and rescue, or maybe neither because they don't like either of those terms. So just exploring that, what it means, how belonging to those different camps changes how you interact with and be with the dogs, and also how you treat each other.
Fascinating. Wonderful. Well, I cannot wait to see the PhD and then the book that will come after that, I'm sure. Where can people find out more about your work?
So I'm on the ASA members page. I'm on Twitter at Justine Groizard. I'm also on my own university webpage. I think mainly Twitter, though. I think probably most active on Twitter.
Wonderful. Well, Justine, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. And you can find us on Twitter at knowing_animals. You can also find us on Facebook at Knowing Animals. And finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.